Please check if I'm on. Oh, good evening. I think we are live. Good evening, everybody. I think we are live. And if there's any sort of thing that we need to do, please just indicate. I hope that I'm also fairly okay, well positioned. Tonight, we have a very important topic to deal with. And we have two panelists. Initially, we're supposed to have at least 5 panelists, 2 for the debate, 2 for Marx, 2 for Biko. We had a difficult time trying to get through to anyone defending what I call Pascal Marx. I'm grateful that Comrade Glenn Farrett, who is the executive director of the SADC Council of Non-Governmental Organizations, a well-known Marxist, a scholar, activist, has gladly agreed to join this panel, and hopefully he'll be able to do justice for the Marxist side of the debate. On the other side, we have Comrade Lindo Kuhle Patiwe. He's a leader of the Pan-African Student Movement of Azania and a member of the Youth Policy Committee at the South African Institute of International Affairs. My name is Andile Mngxitama, and I'm the president of Black First Land First, and I am the author of the publication, Blacks Can't Be Racist. Tonight, we're going to debate the question, Biko or Marx? Or, as it has been going on, it's a very heated debate in South Africa. The debate between what is the primary point of our struggle, race or class. Before we go on, I'd like our panelists just to greet you. We start with Comrade Lindo Kuhle to greet the viewers at home.
Thank you, Comrade Andile. Greetings to you, greetings to the viewers at home. Izwele to Africa.
Enkosi Comrade Lindo Kuhle. And then Comrade Glenn. Comrade Glenn. Comrade Glenn, I don't know if it's in Botswana or I think they start the Council of Non-Governmental Organization. It might be based outside of South Africa. I've not even checked that. Comrade Glenn.
Can you hear me now, Comrade?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So we are based in Gaborone, Botswana, but I am, of course, as you've said, a South African. And just to clarify, I'm here in a private activist capacity and not in a paid capacity. So my views do not reflect. But thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Comrade Glenn. But my first, the way we'll run this thing, for all of you who are viewing this debate, I will go first and I will frame the debate the way I understand it, and the 2 comrades will then respond and make their own contribution to the conversation. Then we will have a go at whatever we think has emerged that needs clarification. It might be a few rounds of to and froing between the 3 of us. Then we will come to your questions. So when you're viewing at home, you already know the debate. You might have followed the debate. You have your own questions. Please send those questions. Type your questions as text on the Facebook page. They will be sent to us. We'll be able to go. Tonight, we're going to go systematically. We'll try at best to answer each question as it is being asked. Okay, so I go first. And then let me also explain again that one of the panelists who's not here, Comrade Ziana Lategan, she's in the United States of America, and in the city she is based, there is a protest tonight, which is led by the Black Lives Matter, and that's why she's not here. She's on the ground. And when I spoke to her, I said, we are just going to be debating. The real struggle is on the ground. Go, fight. Shake that Molotov cocktail and make some fire happen. So that comrade is not here. She's on the ground representing occupied Azania in that battlefield. you know, I also was thinking that it is actually quite infuriating that in South Africa today, the police, the army continue to kill our people. Not only that, you saw some racist representation of Dr. Andile Mngxitama by some crazy white racist, and we seem to be generally paralyzed. But I was thinking when I look at that in Nkosazana to say, there you are. She's a minister, she's a doctor, she is not immune to racist attack. This suggesting that, you know, and this is where we will go with this debate, this idea by Black Marxists that the problem is class, is problematic, does not capture the problem of Black people. In Blacks Can Be Racist, we identify 3 dispossessions that are part of the creation of the category Black. We deal with the dispossession of land, dispossession of labor, dispossession of the African sense of being. And already there's a critique of Marxist ideology in terms of, okay, Marx is basically saying we need to go through capitalism to go through communism. So we must suffer. This is the theology of Marx. The pain of capitalism to go to the nirvana of communism. In there, I'm arguing that destruction of the African way of life is a destruction of what approximate even Marx's own idea of communism. So for instance, I mean, if you read in Blacks Can Be Racist, the representation of the colonialists as recorded by anthropologists, when they arrive in the Cape, they look at us. Firstly, they find that we are completely idle. We don't want to work. We hate labor. So they say, these people are lazy. And then they find us our sexual mores, you know, and that's why the conservative hotel doesn't get it. Our African sexual mores, sexual practices were far advanced by the time the colonialists arrived here, and they started disciplining us. So you can only have sex in this way. You can only have sex with that one. And if you don't do this, you are considered uncivilized. So I'm arguing that the destruction of the African way of being. Firstly, we have liberated ourselves from the grudges of labor, the dredges of labor. We are realizing ourselves. We're valorizing contemplation, idleness. These are the categories that Marx reserves for communism. So there's firstly just the attack there on Marxist method of understanding what progress signifies. Just then to bring it quickly at the contemporary debates emanating from this is that in South Africa, we've seen that debate, and Comrade Eli Ndekuhle is part of that debate, where people are called Blackists versus Black Marxists, right? So us Blackists are Black nationalists, and we have charged Marxism as racist and inadequate, even inappropriate to deal with the Black question. We Blackists insist that the determining factor is race, not class. In fact, class is race, where Blacks are the only real workers. There are no white workers. There are, as Lenin actually says, a bourgeois proletariat. Now, this is the first category of our criticism of Marxism, that Marxism seems to think that there is a thing called white worker. Such does not exist. This is the first point of argument that we are making, right? The second is that, and this is my argument, and I don't know Comrade Ndekuhle's point here. Firstly, I say Marx himself is not, Marx is not, okay, as some people like, he is a product of his time, all white people at this time are racist. No. Marx could have chosen differently, but Marx himself is racist. That's the first thing. Marx, I mean, look at how he refers to Lassalle's, competition. He says this guy is a nigger. Look at the shape of his head. I mean, he couldn't possibly be a thinker on the basis of this. That's the first thing, that Marx is a racist. But more importantly, the Marxist or Marxism as a method is both colonial and anti-black. And I think that is the more question of analytical category. Marxism is both colonial and anti-black. And this really goes back to this idea of Marx that society has to go through epochs and the non-civilized world must be colonized so that it can enter into civilization, which is capitalism, so that it can go to communism. So Marxist methodology accepts colonialism, drives colonialism. In fact, Marx's friend, Friedrich Engels, is so open about it. He is even aware of the Dutch East India Company. That is good, that Europe is penetrating these uncivilized worlds to colonize them, to bring them civilization, because civilization liberation is Europe, is advanced Europe. So therefore, I mean, I have now come to this conclusion that Marx and Marxism has nothing to offer black people. The people who are being shot in the streets of the US are black people, irrespective of class. They don't go around asking, are you working class or not? You are black, you get shot. But coming back to this idea of the white worker, which is what the black Marxists are trying to argue, say, no, but you guys of blackies, there are white workers who are oppressed. There is international solidarity. In fact, and I think Comrade Lindo here will be quite helpful. If you look at what Jaffe's argument is, which basically is Lenin's argument, the white worker is, in fact, part of the bourgeois class, in the sense that he shares with the white bourgeois, white bourgeoisie, if you like, the proceeds of exploitation of the black worker. So you can see, I mean, Jaffe and Lenin actually look at actual figures to show how the white worker is subsidized by the oppression of the black worker. You know something I've just now discovered, which is very interesting. Cecil John Rhodes actually listens to, in England, listens to the white worker suffering, complaining in the bars. And he says, you know, we can solve this problem. How to solve the problem of poverty of the white worker is to colonize Africa. Let me repeat this. Cecil John Rhodes looked at the suffering of white people and the white worker in Europe. And he says, how can we solve this problem? He says we can solve this problem by colonizing Africa. You know what is interesting? Marx should have known about this, should have anticipated what the meaning of colonialism in terms of subsidizing white workers. In his own calculation, he should have been able to see that. But it is Lenin who actually says, wait, Lenin, I'm arguing, breaks with Marx on this question of what is the meaning of colonialism vis-a-vis the white worker, the proletariat. Lenin is clear that colonialism, which in his text, the advanced, capitalism, the advanced capitalism, imperialism is the advanced capitalism. He says, well, these colonial enclaves subsidize the white worker. As a consequence, the white worker becomes a bourgeois proletariat. And therefore, in fact, the bourgeois proletariat could not possibly lead any struggle for the socialist emancipatory project. Lenin breaks with Marx here. You know, I want to conclude here because I am shocked when I read now that South African Marxists are so ignorant of this serious lapses in Marxism. South African Marxists are completely unaware of this serious critique of how Marxism is anti-Black. It is shocking for me, reading Marx now more critically, to come to this conclusion. However, the conclusions that Lenin is raising about imperialism, colonialism, and the white worker are the conclusion that Afro-pessimism, I think, and Steve Biko have already arrived at. Steve Biko is clear there is no white worker. I mean, he says, if you say solidarity, go talk to Van Tonder in the Free State. Van Tonder was supposed to be a white working class man, a AfriForum member today, a Solidarity member today. This is the vanguard of white supremacy. The white working class is the vanguard of white supremacy. Marxists cannot explain why the white worker is not behaving as a revolutionary subject as expected by Marx. Because precisely, Marx's revolutionary subject would be a white worker who does exactly what AfriForum is doing to defend its interests. Let me conclude by just referring to the great work done by Afro-pessimists. Afro-pessimists have also said, look, Marxism cannot be adequate to answer the Black question. We are not just oppressed as workers, but there's something more fundamental. Capitalism, as Black bodies, as Black people, we are at the base of the creation of capitalism. Black people are not contributing their labor power to capital. We are not contributing our labor power. We are not just exploited. Ourselves are a factor of production, a commodity that can be bought. And in fact, white workers have bought themselves Black people. That is a major difference. A white worker is exploited in as far as they sell their labor power to some extent, subsidized by Black labor. But not only that, we know that Black people are at the base of capitalism. That is why the argument by Black Marxists that when we reject Marxism in these terms, we embrace capitalism does not hold. We understand that fundamental to capitalism is the Black body. Therefore, it is not possible for us to actually go with capitalism. We are the most anti-capitalist, if you like, activists and thinkers by thinking Black. So that is why I reject, and I conclude here, I reject very strenuously this idea that you can be Pan-Africanist and you need scientific socialism. You can be Black consciousness and you need scientific socialism. No one has explained what is not scientific about Pan-Africanism and Black consciousness. No one has yet explained what is not socialist about Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism. I argue these scientific socialists are simply driving a Eurocentric agenda to undermine the serious sort of philosophical work and critique of capital from a Black perspective as represented by both Pan-Africanism and Black consciousness. So I stop there, but from where I move is from the Black can't be racist, where we're looking at the creation of the Black and the meaning of Black people as an oppressed category in a situation of white supremacy, which is essentially but capitalist exploitation as well. I'll stop there. So yes, comrades, you can go. Whoever wants to go first, go first. Comrade Lindo, you are on our screens.
No, thank you, Lita. Yeah, it seems like me and you are just going to be agreeing throughout here.
Good.
I think to first start off with, I think it must be said that at the core of it, you are correct to say that the Marxist methodology itself is fundamentally problematic for us. The PAC in the Africanist Manifesto argues that we are against foreign domination in all of its manifestations. And what the teleology of the Marx argues, as you correctly point out, if society as a whole, and by this he studies only Europe, and then he argues that if society as a whole is to advance, we need to go through this capitalistic moment. Now, once you do that, you bring the entire mode of production of Europe into the African context. And this is not just people oppressed on class and all of that. it brings with it the philosophy of Europe, the ways of life of Europe, the understanding of what a subject is and what a being is into the African context. And here we are then forced into colonialism by Marx at a methodological level. So he in himself has to, by method, be a proponent of colonialism. Even get those who argue that Marx was not necessarily racist. I mean, he himself was racist, as you point out. Not only was his methodology racist, he has also been, in many points, forced this idea that we need to go into this European mode of production. This completely, as Biko talks to us, completely kills the black man, produces only a shell of the former selves. So this is a problem for us. And I think something maybe we need to think about when Andile is, I think the idea of asking questions of why did they come here? Was it because they wanted resources, or they simply wanted to colonize us based on our skin color? Is neither here nor there, right? Because what we know is that they came, and what we know is that they killed black people. Whatever this reason for them coming is, it can be neither here or nor there. As earlier on spoke about that, the multiplicity of things. And I think that we can be able to even use this, because they want to, sometimes there's argument that the Black existentialist school or Afro-Pes is idealistic. We don't deal with material problems. I mean, what's idealistic about the fact that black people were taken as slaves? What's idealistic about the fact that it was black people whose land was taken away from them? This is a fact of history. It is the facticity of what we find ourselves in. And my argument is that we can find at the materialistic, even if we use the materialistic concept of understanding our situation, we can still end up in arguing that the fundamental is race. Because the question of asking us why did they come here, they want to dislodge us of this thing. So if you argue that no, they came here for the land, then the fundamentals, according to Black Marxists, stops being race. But the question that is not asked is, let's say they came here for the resources that we have. What informs the European thinking that these people are to be treated in a particular way? What informs the idea that you can just take their land, you can just kill them? This is not as they want us to believe, that it comes after they've arrived here. Now they start to think about, okay, let's raise them. Let's create a race all of a sudden. No, we were raised even before coming. So the issue that even within capitalism in itself is racist. So even if you make use of this materialistic understanding of the problem, you will still have to get to a point where you argue that race is the fundamental that we talk about. And the consequences of this is, in terms, and this is, many people say this discussion is not necessary, it doesn't really deal with, it doesn't take us forward in any way. And I think this is a flaw here, because it does make us reconsider many things that have been fundamental in the struggle against colonialism and imperialism. One, questions of international solidarity, for example. Who do you put as your allies? If we can successfully, and I think we have, make the point that there's no such thing as a white worker, then the question is, what business do we have in having solidarity with white people? What business do white people have in our organizations and in fighting against colonialism with us? So it is important that at all material times we stress this point, that at the center of it is the race question, as you pointed out. And this, for me, I think what I recently found out is important is that we need not actually go outside of their methodologies sometimes, even though in their conception of history, it does have a racist problem. But we can even use that whole analysis of materialism and still be able to say that at the core of it is the race question. What we then find post the 1994 situation again is that we find a situation where they want to create a situation. We have to look at certain individuals like Abu Patrice Motsepe, Cyril Ramaphosa, blah, 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 as part of this capitalist class. Biko deals with this question very beautifully. That there are those amongst us as Black people who will work against Black liberation. And he has a category for them, which is the non-white category. Now the question becomes, what then does Marxism help us in this situation? Even if you bring these Blacks who are rich and have all their money, Biko deals with it as well. And also, what you find out time and time again is that even these so-called rich Blacks are unable to escape the category of existence as Black people. For them to enjoy the privileges they have to maintain a close proximity to whiteness. Cyril Ramaphosa must at all times go around with the tag of being one of the richest guys in the country, being a president of the country. But should he remove himself of all of those security guards, wear normal clothes like everyone else, he's seen like a normal Black person. Also, these racist ideas that we find continuing because of the mode of production that is brought by Europe is even in the public response to the ascendance of Zuma into power. Leave the problematics, of course, I know you comrades are forces of Zuma, but let's leave the problematics of how Zuma himself may be problematic in many ways. But what you find out, even before Zuma came into power, what many people disagreed with was not necessarily the fact that he was corrupt, but the fact that he has this Zulu tribal aesthetic about him that white people do not like. So when you protest against Zuma being corrupt, the white person next to you is not protesting against Zuma, he's protesting against a Zulu tribalist here. Yeah. He's protesting against someone who has this particular Black aesthetic. Now he's protesting against you at that moment. You think you are all together against Zuma, but in actual fact, you are protesting against your own African personality. This is when then the argument, we argue that this is another form of domination here. At a symbolic order, whiteness still dominates our country in all of its facets. When a white beggar thinks that they are better than you, they actually, it's not, what's that, the biggest term that is always used, the idea of false consciousness or bad faith, something like that. In actual fact, the social symbolic order of South Africa agrees with the white beggar. It is not in contradiction with them. When a white beggar goes and protests with all other white people, police deals with them in a different way than they do when they deal with Black people. Even when it was rich kids of UCT that were protesting, they were not saved from bullets. So you find out here that there's something far more than our class positions in society. There is a deeper form of oppression that takes place. And to argue, for me, the critic to argue that this is a phenomenon of the fundamental, which is class, is to miss the point. Because we find that it is fundamental to it. If they came here to take our land, the question must be asked, why was it so that they thought that they can deal with Black people in this particular way? Are we saying that there was no other way of being able to use African resources other than this one, because they had to take a conscious decision in how they're going to create their looting in Africa. And they took this kind of form. This has to go beyond simply issues of class. So yeah, I think before I go too long, that is my one. And I think lastly is that we must dismiss, demystify this idea that when we say black first, we want to erase issues of capitalism within our society. No, we are not saying that we must be friends with Cyril Ramaphosa who kill people in Marikana. We recognize the contradictions amongst black people. But what we are saying is that we have answers to those questions that do not need to take us to Marxism or to Marx. Biko is already doing that for us. Sobuk already did that for us. Peter Eke already did that for us. So the question they must bring to us, what is it that these African scholars have not brought in that is fundamental, that only Marx can bring in? I thank you.
Thanks for that contribution. We'll come back to some of the issues you raised, but now we allow Comrade Glenn to speak to us.
Thanks, comrades. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, good. Let me start off by saying I think we're probably discussing something that we're not discussing. And I think as the conversation goes and we get a chance to refine it, we will find we must find this elephant in the room that we are hunting. And its name is not Karl Marx. Karl Marx is dead, comrades. So let's re-examine the question, because I think what you have introduced in this discussion is a group of people who call themselves Marxists. Yeah, and they are not here among us now to defend themselves. So I'm not going to speak for them. And I think we must draw clear lines of battle with those confusionists and opportunists who want to render somehow our relationship with our oppression as a hypothetical, as a theoretical consideration, which must come through some adoption of an alien or foreign ideology to guide us to our freedom. Yeah. So let's start there to say that let those people articulate themselves in their own confusion. My job here is not to speak for whatever that is. Let me come to the topic a little bit differently. From the point of view of Marx, or as we can appreciate, revolutionary Marxism. I think there have been some very useful points made already. So where does Marx start? I think it's interesting for me that Marx makes one fundamental change to probably his most famous work, namely the Communist Manifesto. And it's actually a footnote which comes some years later. And if I can find it, hold on. I want us to just dwell on this. He makes a footnote to the first passage of the Communist Manifesto, where he says, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, full stop. And then he goes on to talk about those class struggles in a very European, Eurocentric fashion. And he arrives at this clarity that the struggle is between something he calls the proletariat and something he calls the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx is the founder of what we know as political economy. I want to make that point because it's useful for us to circle back to it, because it's reverberating through this conversation. Political economy, that there is no economy on the one side and then politics on the other. Marx creates a method of analysis that says, explore this connection between politics, how society is governed, and how society is ordered. And you will arrive at its truth. And he says that truth is that capitalism simplifies class contradictions between something he calls the proletariat and something he calls the bourgeoisie. But he adds a footnote, and I'm going to just, Andile is familiar with this as a Trotskyist. We quote. So let me quote for the sake of accuracy. He says, that is all written history. So remember this phrase. He says, the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle. Then he comes some years later and he says, no, no, no. It's only written history. And he says, wait. When we look more deeply, there were societies that exist, pre-colonial societies which exist, pre-feudal societies which exist, pre-slave societies which exist. And those societies, he says, are remarkably egalitarian. They are remarkably just. And they are remarkably simple in how they are ordered. And he says this inner organization, this thing, the way this society has been, is in fact primitive communism. He describes it as primitive communism. And then, so this is an important point because it speaks to, I think, the charge of Marx is somehow inherently only a product of his time, reflecting only ideas of his time, reflecting only the geography of his time and his class and his race. So Marx steps out of that and he says, before all of this, before class society began, there was another type of society, and that society he defines clearly as being primitive communist. And then he says, oh, now this is me saying, interpreting Marx. What Marx means when he says, let us move, what is necessary for humanity is true human liberation. So the movement that we have to go through is to recognize that society is ordered in a particular way, but what we have arrived at is a point where we are able to achieve true human liberation. And he calls that society communist. And he says quite consciously and deliberately that that is the society which we seek, which we have a precedent for. It existed before. It can exist again if the struggle is carried through to its logical conclusion, namely the liquidation of capital. Now we come back to this nexus, this huge problem of political economy, this intersection between, if you like, race and class. So I think Andile has gone a long way to begin to build a correct edifice, a starting point from which we can move. That is to say, Marx is not saying colonialism is good. Marx is not saying capitalism is good. Marx is not saying slave societies are good. He's not making a moral judgment. And I think to Comrade Lindo's point, you speak of the methodology of Marxism. And I think it's an important thing that we can explore separately, right? Because Marx is actually dealing with what he regards as philosophical categories. So when he says something is an idealist idea, or when he says something is materialist, Marx is dealing not with any feeling of how I respond to an idea or a thing. He's saying, what is its concreteness? What is its actuality? So what drives colonialism is not, it doesn't matter, Comrade Linda, you're completely correct. It doesn't matter why they came here. But Marx is saying why they came here is exactly what Andile has said. They must bribe their own working class. They must get rid of their surplus people because those people are a danger to them. And they must, as they do in America today, they must buy off those sections of their own oppressed and exploited to become part of a system of capitalist exploitation. So this is perhaps difficult to grasp fully. When Marx says that this is the nature of capitalism, it must go everywhere. It must consume everything until there is nothing left. Yes, that it is digging the grave of everyone, that it is driving humanity to this crisis of barbarism. Marx is not stepping out of the fight against oppression. In fact, he is delineating the basis on which we fight. So once we understand that point, is there then this contradiction that is being posed to say, I am of black consciousness, my black being, and there is this thing called capitalism, which is somewhere, somehow not my concern. How does this arise? How do we begin to think of this as a cleavage, as a disjuncture, as a contradiction? And I think we must explore then not the ideas of Marx, because Marx is clear. Because how could Lenin come to these conclusions if Marx had not built the foundations? Marx is clear. Who are the people who are trying to subvert the essential character of the struggle of black people? And why are they dragging Marx into their defense? Comrades, if we want to have a polemic with these people, then we must call them out, and we must call them out clearly. I'm going to end maybe with one last idea from Trotsky, who, in responding to comrades who were debating very similar issues in the 1930s in South Africa, one of the few times he wrote about South Africa, he had to, although he didn't know much about the country, he made a very sort of necessary intervention. He felt it was necessary to tell them this. The worst crime on the part of revolutionaries would be to give the smallest concession to the privileges and prejudices of the whites. The worst crime on the part of the revolutionaries would be to give the smallest concessions to the privileges and prejudices of the whites. Whoever gives his little finger to the devil of chauvinism, by which he means racism, is lost. Comrades, so, not being lost, we fight together for the liberation of black people by black people, understanding the contradictions of capitalism.
I mean, well-considered attempt to, I think, somehow present Marx still within the category of a liberatory, theoretical, contributions. I just move very clearly from this point that I reject Marx completely, including his categories. And I'm not sure, Comrade Glenn, that you can rescue Marx with simply presenting political economy as somehow indifferent to race. It's just a scientific proposition which, if we apply it, we will go to this path of clarification of liberation. You see, Marx makes very clear moves about how do we go to this liberation. And this is the big problem. These moves that Marx makes are precisely what makes him a colonial scholar, a colonial thinker, and anti-black. I mean, I have here, because I do read Marx, I have here his very famous surveys from exile. And in it, of course, he goes through India and China. I mean, this is where Marx himself is up. Of course, it's interesting because in this text, they also bring in his somewhat moralistic critique of slavery. But I think where he deals with articles on India and China, where he deals with the titles of British rule in India, and then the East Indian Company, and history and results, and China, Marx is absolutely clear. You're going to have to colonize India. And of course, he says this is horrible. People are going to die. People are going to suffer. But look, all birth come through the path of blood. He is not moving. And I mean, so I am somehow seduced by this footnote, which you refer to, which in fact, if we were to follow it, it will collapse the Marxist science completely. It will collapse his investment in the mode of productions. It will collapse his notions of how class struggle is moving from one epoch to the next. Because then you are making the point that we're making. We're saying, look, our societies already had serious elements of communism. And this idea that Marx presents of the necessity of a capitalist transition is precisely what makes him a colonialist. I mean, look, if I don't know South African Marxists, don't read Marx. I mean, the Communist Manifesto essentially is a text in praise of capitalism, the bourgeois epoch, the movement from the earlier, epochs. The bourgeois epoch is precisely this epoch which is problematic for categories of societies outside of Europe. So I'm saying you still have a big difficulty to resolve these questions, that the claims that you make, Marxist method itself is anti-black and colonial. Then, Comrade Lindo, you know, and no, just you, Comrade Len, please do come back. You know, the Trotsky, I'm reading Trotsky again. I mean, I have a little Trotsky's introduction to Marx. You know, I mean, I read all these things, but I don't have his Trotsky and his national question. The Black Republic, this thesis, I don't understand how South African Trotskyites, they regard Trotsky as the ultimate thinker, but they never deal with the Black Republic thesis. I mean, the part of which you have just referred to, there must be an explanation. Why is it that Trotsky is very clear in South Africa, you need a Black Republic, a Black Republic. So it dovetails our argument about the blackness. But the question is, Trotskyites, they are the worst in being race denialists in South Africa. They are the ones who move to class, and then they share this with these Black Marxists who, for some reason, hate the Black so-called bourgeoisie more than they hate white monopoly capital. And that is for Comrade Lindo. Comrade Lindo, we can't also quickly skirt around the issue. How is it that organizations such as AZAPO and the PAC adopt scientific socialism over and above Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism? We have to explain what is happening here. Something is happening here which doesn't make sense, because these indigenous modes of thinking somehow are being strengthened by this notion of scientific. We need to explain what is happening here. Of course, one of the explanations is simply that both AZAPO and the PAC have no faith and do not have, if you like, confidence in Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism as sufficient theoretical categories to help us think through our oppression and to organize resistance. So we must still come back to that issue. And then also, just for you two comrades, is there a Black bourgeoisie? Because the Black Marxists are quick to say there's a Black bourgeoisie and this is the problem. I want to put forward a proposition that says, in fact, the idea of a Black bourgeoisie is not real in the South African context. Even Ramaphosa, Motsepe, they are subordinated bourgeoisie. They can only exist in as far as white monopoly capital says so. So they are just really servants of capital, real capital, which is white monopoly capital. And take us back to the position that Black First Land First holds. The central contradiction is a contradiction against white monopoly capital. Of course, you'll have take Ramaphosa. The workers of Marikana will be murdered for his profits. But actually, Ramaphosa owns only about 10% of Lonmin. 10% of Lonmin. This is what Ramaphosa owns. 90% of Lonmin is owned by white people and people from London. So how is it that Ramaphosa somehow becomes a bigger problem than Lonmin that owns 90% of the company, which is basically sending him as a consequence or as a result of him being part of the state system to bring in the police to murder workers to secure the profits of Lonmin. So I'm raising this question very sharply. Does a Black bourgeoisie exist? And I'm not saying Ramaphosa, Motsepe, and so on are not problematic. They are. But it seems to me that this labor that we expand on them is a diversion from the real ruling class, which controls everything, including politics. Comrade Lindo, do you have any interventions? And also you can respond to some of the things that Comrade Glenn has raised.
Yeah. I wanted to poke some questions on precisely on your argument around the rejection in total, right? Because my question is, are we to make the argument that the Marxist concept around how you study society, its relation to production, the people's relation to production, how they reproduce each other. I think for me that there's nothing necessarily racist here in that part, right? But what we can then find is that in our context, what this relation to production creates a racist society. So I wanted to ask a question. Don't you think that part in Marx can be salvaged? And I mean, also
I reject it, my friend. I reject. You see, there was a time I didn't. There was a time I didn't. There was a time I thought, you know, Marx's category, particularly in dealing with the structure of capital, help us a lot. And I mean, I would still argue that you must go through your Marxist texts. But Marx is incapable in all these moments. Marx is incapable to deal with the black question. I'm arguing there's nothing in the black radical tradition which is unable to provide an explanation of the structure of society which centers the black experience. And this becomes adequate for us to understand capital, to understand power, and to understand the contradiction of capital itself. There's nothing in black radical tradition which stops us from understanding. So once you move from Marx, you have to come to this logical conclusion of his method. I mean, how else do you study Marx without accepting that capital or a capitalist mode of production is central to progress? I mean, if you don't accept this, I don't think you can claim to be Marxist. So I'm arguing that, well, if you reject these categories of Marx, my argument is, I'm no longer accept Marx as a useful. In fact, these Hotep brothers who hate Marx because he's white are fine. I mean, they're not going to argue, they're not going to get into this difficulty of how to understand Marxist methods. They have a visceral rejection of Marx on the basis of which whiteness is a correct attitude. And then we can argue also, I think scientifically, looking at this method, that Jaffe does a great work. And I mean, I know you are exposed to Jaffe. I don't know in South Africa why anyone who studies Marx does not immediately study Jaffe alongside. Because once you do that, you will disabuse yourself of the fact that Marxist categories are useful.
Yeah, and we must just remove Marx and put Jaffe in. But there's another point I wanted to look. I think Braeja is one of the things that we must be careful, we must acknowledge within our liberation movements, right, over the years. And I think Udladla always makes this point, is the deep ideological infiltration that happens around the post-Biko.
Yeah.
In our movements. So, for example, if you look at the PAC's understanding of socialism and their argument why it's scientific is that it takes the concrete realities of of Africa as the starting base. The fact that our land was taken away from us and we want to restore the land. There is something weird that happens in the 80s, where then the word scientific just gets put in as if to say African socialism is not scientific in itself. There is a method in how they do this thing. But the 80s moment, I think also Gibson, in that book of yours, Biko Leaves, deals with the problem of the post-Biko BC movement. And I think there has been a serious ideological infiltration of the Black part of the importance then of constantly coming back to this question is to do away with this idea. Because and it seems to be a static and standard modus operandi. A revolutionary moment that centers blackness happens, you dislodge Marxists and you dislodge white people completely from the center of attention. They keep quiet for some 2 to 3 or 4 years. And then when there's a lull, they come back in mass. You don't know where they're coming from, but they just out of the blue come back and bring us back to this old age question. So I do think there is, it's a sad part into the Black organizations, this imposition of the scientific that happens, as if the original standpoints of centering race is not scientific in itself, unless we have a different conceptualization of what scientific is. They can argue for us. But for me, then, in answering you, is that this whole scientific socialism thing is nothing but an ideological infiltration of our movement.
Comrade Lindo, you're not going to also get away with this problem. You see, once you reject these categories of Marxism, and like you do, and center race as strongly as you do, you must reflect on what's happening inside the Pan-Africanist Congress from inception. Because it's interesting, because Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania breaks away from the ANC precisely on the race question by and large, from the point of control of the liberation movement by these white liberals, who, of course, imposes the Freedom Charter on the ANC, so Sobukwe will move. But Sobukwe's non-racialism is contradictory. It is only when Biko resolved this problem. And so I don't know, you know, I listen to you.
In what sense is this contradictory?
Because while it rejects, okay, Comrade Glenn?
Yeah, no, I think, Andile, I think there's an important point you make about how far Sobukwe goes and what he leaves unresolved. Or the germination of the journey towards Black consciousness and Sobukwe's contribution, but not yet fully realized. Yeah, and I think it's an important thing to unpack. But I think it will take us, if we have time. But if we could I suggest we go back to some of what you've said on Marx before we deal with Sobukwe.
Marx before Sobukwe. Yes.
Marx Uber als. No, I'm joking completely. So let's just deal with this thing clearly. So this idea of scientific socialism is a Stalinist invention. Yeah, let's be very clear. It serves people who have taken over control of worker states in some way or another, and they create this fictional thing called scientific socialism. If you ask them what it is, just outside of any debate, what is scientific about their socialism, they will give you no clarity. So I don't think we need to concern ourselves overly with something that was really just a momentary kind of thing that happened when liberation movements across the continent and in Asia and Latin America were seeking support from what was then the Soviet Union, and they all felt it necessary to adapt or adopt this thing called scientific socialism, which those people said that they had achieved. Now we know that that's not true. History has proven that. And speaking about history, I think we need to be careful about being ahistorical. In other words, when we want to arrive at an essential critique of the contribution of revolutionary thinkers and how they assist us or hinder us in our thinking, I think we have to kind of try not to miss certain things. So this idea, Andile, which you have repeated, is again a fallacy. This is essentially a reformist idea that capitalism is good, that Marx promotes capitalism, and therefore everybody must go through capitalism in this way, and that all the consequences of capitalism are in themselves therefore acceptable to Marx. You made reference to India, China, and so on. So we have to come back to that point and say, let us not be ahistorical, because Marx does not suggest in any way that the development of capitalism is a positive thing. In fact, he says the opposite. And what he arrives at is the idea that you need to liquidate this class of people. Because here, to your point later, when you speak of, is there a black bourgeoisie? And I think this is an important debate to pick up. What Marx is saying, when I say that Marx, as a scholar, as a revolutionary, as a thinker, pioneers this notion of political economy, it becomes relevant when we unpack who are these people who we call white monopoly capital, and is there such a thing as a black bourgeoisie? Marx is making the point, the very, very important point. He says capital is a social relation. Capital is not a thing that exists somewhere mystically. Yeah? And maybe this is how there's been this perversion of Marxism throughout history, particularly in the South African context, whether people have claimed to be Trotskyists or whether they've been members of the Communist Party or anything else. The kind of Marx that I think has been brought has come in these two forms. One from white liberals who have essentially attempted to ignore and deny the national question, the black question in South Africa, and have tried to consciously promote some idea that there is non-racialism which is achievable through a mystical class struggle. Now, that is anti-Marxist, right? Because we're saying, as Marxists, as any revolutionary, we recognize that the black working class is the fundamental driving force of the revolution. But we cannot sit here and pretend that there isn't a thing called capitalism, that it hasn't asserted itself all over the world, that it doesn't dominate the social relations, not only the forms of production. All these things that the capitalists have are real. The guns that they have, the armies that they have, the political connections, the ability to run and capture states, the ability to confuse the masses, the ability to buy off. It is a capitalist system is an international system. And when we confront it, we are not only confronting the white oppressor, we are confronting a social system, a social relation of oppression and exploitation. Now, our means of struggle must always be revolutionary, that it must be guided and grounded in the clarity of the consciousness of the class itself. And our class is the black working class, which is the motive force of our revolution. So I think it is necessary for me to perhaps make this clarification, that this idea that we must go through stages, that capitalism is good, it must be everywhere, it must achieve a certain level of development, and then we can address other things, or within the confines of capitalism, this idea that this socialist project, the revolutionary class project, is not at one with the oppressed, I think is incorrect. So to rescue Marx a little bit in this discussion, but I think then it becomes important for us to delve into some of those social relations. What do we mean when we say there is a black bourgeoisie? If capital is a social relation, is it possible for a black person to insert themselves in that social relation as an owner of capital, or are they merely agents of capital? And I think that that's an important discussion because it informs the contours of our struggle. But, comrades, we still have a very big problem. Do you accept that capitalism is real, that it dominates the world, that it organizes the world through its own anarchy? And I think that's an important question, because if we are to sit here and say there isn't a thing called capitalism, that whiteness exists abstractly, that it's only whiteness that we wish to oppose, that we do not want to expropriate the basis by which white people exercise their power, from which they derive their power, the source of which is black labor.
But Comrade Glenn, sorry, I understand, and a lot of black consciousness proponents would agree. Whiteness is precisely the concentration, an expression of capital, precisely. And the opposite is true, that blackness precisely is this category of the victim of this process, which is the proletarian moment in that relation. So it's a foregone conclusion that we're anti-capitalist and capitalism is real, and white supremacy finds its expression in the economic category as what we call in South Africa white monopoly capital. These are real things. And our struggle essentially is about precisely the dislodging of capital. And for us, capital is whiteness. These two categories are concentrated as one. We can't disarticulate it.
And also, Comrade Glenn, in you coming back, also can you answer to this? You argue that Marx makes no moral judgments on capitalism, but what would you make of his view in what's that article? The future results of British rule in India, because it seems to make it categorically clear that capitalism, if the British people were to choose for, of course, as the British people as whites and those who can think on behalf of others, if they can choose between British colonialism by Britain in India or leave India to be from its feudalistic caste systems, it seems that capitalism, the colonialism of India by Britain, is the better devil here. So even if he's saying that capitalism is still a devil, he's saying it's a better one. So there is a moral argument that he's making here. He's not simply, it doesn't seem that he's simply making an observation, an academic observation of how capitalism can form itself. He does seem to make clearly a moral judgment between two modes of production, or two modes of system, and he chooses out of a moral basis capitalism through colonialism.
Comrade Glenn?
You are muted, leader.
There's also a possibility of just
or the time lag.
Time lag. but it's also possible that he's in Botswana. They don't have 5G. So.
Don't see, that is the kind of Marxism we don't need, comrades. The Botswana, comrade, fine. They don't need your Marxism.
And 5Gs, eh?
And 5Gs. You see, you will find yourself on the wrong end of this debate. No, I want us to be clear, comrade. Comrade Linda, to your point. One of the things that Marx does assert is that it is impossible for a lower level, a mode of production, you are correct to speak of this, is a clash between two modes of production, what Marx calls the Asiatic mode of production and capitalism. And he says that the consequences of this is going to be devastating, right? And that capitalism is going to win this battle. And it will cause an even worse amalgam where you have the worst forms of feudalism and the aspects of landlessness and deprivation, the caste system, etc., in India and in China, actually, to that point. But capitalism as a higher technical capacity will be victorious. So you can take that as a moral judgment. I don't. I think it's clear what Marx means. But you also have to take the other side of the point, where Marx writes very directly, politically, about these issues. In other words, when he makes it very clear that these workers in Britain who are colonizing the world, or whose capitalism is driving the colonization of the world, cannot move one step forward without the liberation of the peoples of India or China or Ireland, which is one that was right next to Britain, which Marx wrote about much more extensively and much more clearly, to say that you cannot imagine that you will be able to achieve some kind of socialist utopia here while you are oppressing people over there. So I think that's a core thing where we must kind of distinguish where Marx is decisively articulating what is necessary. Marx is not sitting there saying these things are inevitable. He's saying they are likely to happen and these are their likely consequences. But he is, I think, at that time, and as time has moved, I think those positions would have shifted. But he's very clear that you must stand with the anti-colonial movements, that you must seek to liberate people from this political oppression, the societal oppression, this destruction of their way of life. But he's saying, comrades, this thing is happening, it is forceful, it is a global phenomenon, but he does recognize at that point the revolutionary potential of the workers in those countries. And I think we understand this better by the time we get to Lenin. So there's no break, Andile, perhaps as you suggest, between Marx and Lenin, other than time. And what Lenin is articulating is there in Marx on the anti-colonial struggles in these countries, but it's happening at a point where it becomes very apparent that there is no peaceful road under capitalism anymore. That capitalism, and this is the key point, that what Marx is driving at some point, capitalism, which is this really powerful force, becomes a barbaric system. It is a barbaric system in any case, and it becomes counter itself. Yeah, it becomes just a force for destruction. At that point, we have to choose between socialism or barbarism. That's the point that Marx is making throughout. That is what makes him revolutionary, because he's articulating what is the social basis, what is the economic basis, what is the political basis under which this occurs everywhere. Capitalism, in many ways, is a system which is like a virus. It can only keep on by eating itself. And what does that eating mean? It's eating us, it's eating humanity, so that a very, very small group of people can consume things that they can never actually consume in their lives. So the basis of our struggle is to recognize that capitalism drives this injustice. It asserts itself as a social and economic and political system, and it is a global system. So if we are to address the task of our liberation...
Let me interject there. You keep on referring correctly to capitalism as a global system, and I mean, I think this is part of our critique, that whilst a global system, it affects different people differently, and even from its inception, when it comes to Africa, it does a different process from what it does in Europe as a form of primitive accumulation. Right? In Europe, you don't, of course it's brutal, but it does not enslave the white body. It does not turn them into a factor of production. It can remove them from soil. As we know, there was a lot of movement of people from land, but there is no enslavement of the body. When it comes to Africa, it actually goes for the body. It goes for the person. And this, it does only in the African sense. And that's why part of our critique for capital is that, or for Marxists, is that this overdetermination of the economic category that, oh, they oppress us, and Comrade Lindo was saying they oppress us and then they need to find the justification, does not make sense. They came here for economic reasons and then they have to justify their exploitation. The truth of the matter is, it would have been cheaper, much more economically sensible to enslave white people in Europe by Americans, the vagabonds, because at this time there's a lot of surplus white people in Europe who could have been enslaved, put in the same position that they put black people, whom they have to travel far and long, economically highly costly, to come and capture black bodies in the African continent, when you could simply go to Europe and capture those white people and make them slaves. So this is where capitalism is a global system. However, it knows which body needs to be treated as an animal and which body sanctity must be protected, must be respected. We break with Marx there, and I think that's where we break with notions of global solidarity. That is why even today in the America and the US, where these white kids are out supposedly supporting the struggle and banning stuff, the people who are going to suffer and continue to suffer the wrath of that state is the black body. The bullets, when they come, they kind of come for the black body, not for the white kid who throws a petrol bomb, kisses the lava, and take a selfie. For us, the consequences of being out there is death. For white kids, maybe jail, maybe this sort of thing. So once you accept that capitalism is a global system, our trouble is the fact that we are not inserted in that system equally as the same people. Because of our blackness, we are inserted differently. And that's where we break with Marx. And I believe that's where Lenin breaks with Marx. Because Lenin looks at the colonialists. He says, wait, these enclaves are subsidizing the white worker. Now, there's a tension we're not going into on Marx, and I mean, I hope that we will get into the questions. Marx have moments where he moralizes himself away from his scientific method, if you like. So, for instance, his scientific method will accept capitalism, will praise capitalism, but then he sees the horror of capitalism and says, whoa, maybe we need to do something else. And we as black people who are victims of capitalism and colonialism cannot afford to play with that attention. It is absolutely clear where we stand with this question. And that is why, from where I'm sitting today, I have no affinity to Marxism whatsoever. I just think it's an anti-black problematic category of analysis which takes it away from the black problematic. Comrade Lindo, let's hear if you have something to say. We'll go to questions and maybe moving towards closure. Understand that we'll close at 9:30. Comrade Lindo and then Comrade, yeah.
Let's go to questions. Let's go to questions.
Okay. Okay, so the questions are coming, but as we wait for the questions, Comrade Glenn, do you have any, Comrade Glenn, you know, I raised the issue of the Black Republic, and I was raising it as a problem, in the sense that I don't understand how South African Marxists failed to deal with this question, because Trotsky was absolutely clear. So there is a question that has come through. I want to ask what is the position of PAC, of Pan-Africanism Black Consciousness Bloc, as represented by Comrade Lindo and Mngxi, on scientific socialism? If the problem of the objective of scientific socialism rests on the premise that it is a Marxist idea, then what is alternative for the Pan-Africanist and Black consciousness on this salvation of Black liberation? Or what kind of socialism do we envisage in a colonized humanist society that centers the project of Black liberation? So he asked that question about Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism and scientific socialism. And then Comrade Andile Mngxitama says, Andile, you're missing the point of slave trade. Africa was a market. They trade with goods, people who work for them. It was an economic benefit. Now, Comrade Andile, go read again. I'm not going to waste time about that. Go read your history. I'm not going to waste. Go read. Why wouldn't they have this market in Europe? Why come so far for that market? In fact, do the calculations, you'll see yourself. It would be much easier to have a market in Europe of these white bodies. I mean, why do you come so far? You know how many people will actually have to be dropped dead in the Atlantic? Of course, because their cargo, they sometimes even insured black people so that they can dump them in the ocean. Because symbolically, we were not human beings in the eyes of the white world. So no, it is not an economic question. It is a race question. Yes, Comrade Lindo, you want to respond to the first question?
Are we going at these questions?
Yeah, I want us to go
one,
back to the first. Yeah, I just jotted on that one of Biko about markets, but I think let's go back to the question which was the first question presented to us. And Comrade Glenn, also you can jump in there, where the question was scientific socialism. If we don't have it, then what is the alternative socialist system if we follow Black consciousness and Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I think let me try and answer that. And look, I think what we need to be clear here is that the PAC or the Pan-Africanist bloc has its own conceptualization of socialism, right? They call it the African socialist democracy, in which at the center of how society is organized is through a upliftment of the spiritual, intellectual, and economic interests of the African people, based on ideas of Ubuntu and humane relations to each other. What we disagree here, I think maybe Muteo here is asking us, we are not simply saying we are disagreeing with the scientific socialism that is forced upon us, that forces us to say that the problem is class. For us, the problem is not class, but the problem is a problem that our land was taken away from as Black people, and Black people, as you say, Andile, their bodies itself are a commodity. But we center then the African spirituality and the African economic interests of the individual that do not necessarily trump that of the collective. So that would be the PAC's conceptualization of scientific socialism.
Yes, and Comrade Glenn, you want to judge in those two questions? I mean, I was asked the question of the market, and I reject that completely. Actually, it shows that if you say Africans were just captured because there was a market, you accept, therefore, the white perspective that we're just cargo. And white people, even at the time, will not treat each other as cargo, not treat each other as objects in exchange, in a sale on the auction block. This is not true. But then there was also the question of scientific socialism. Comrade Glenn? Botswana is far.
No, it's your technical person. I'm struggling with the muting. So to the question of, okay, this let's deal with them in order. The black bodies, right? I mean, for the purpose of capital, why black bodies? Why slavery? Andile, you sort of there, but I think it goes much deeper, right? It is possible to enslave Africans and others, to use them as labor, to insure yourself against any losses. I mean, it's a horrific system, all right? I mean, comrades, this is genocide at a mass scale, but it's driven by the internal logic of capitalism because it can. I think it's important. The simple answer to the question is, why did they commodify? They didn't even commodify? They simply took those bodies, and it was there. So I think when we look at Marx's intervention in the American Civil War, where he firmly sides with the struggle against slavery, right? Precisely because of those reasons. So I think we should explore the question of slavery a little bit more, and I think it would be useful perhaps to have a very focused discussion, I would suggest, on slavery and its role, right? So that we can begin to unpack the political economy of slavery. Why didn't they do it in Europe? Because it's not a question of, if they could have done it, they would have done it. Quite
That's
simply.
not true, comrade. Then I don't accept this. It's not that easy. You can't make that jump so easy. Oh, they could have they could have enslaved whites, but they didn't.
No,
they just went for Africans. This I don't think empirically, and if what we know symbolically about black and white is true. Why? I mean, surely it is economically more sensible to enslave white people in Europe. They didn't do that. They come to Africa. So you simply say, oh, it was just a question of, man, logic of capital, maybe Africa. I think that something is fundamentally wrong with that thinking. And in fact, we know, by the way, the good example is Napoleon. When he is in Haiti, he says, we must defeat the Haitians, not for money, not for economics. It's very clear. But we must stop the march of black people in the world. I mean, if it was about economic category, we would simply say, well, no, we just want the plantation. That's not a Napoleon's preoccupation. Stop them because you want to stop the march of black people in the world. By the way, Marx, whilst making some positive moves against slavery and so on, he also approves of Abraham Lincoln. Marx is too contradictory. At the same time, he says, oh, Abraham Lincoln is our brother and son of the soil, a progressive guy. This is an enslaver. So, I mean, you see, corporate, I mean, even initially when you talk about Marx, it's always these deep contradictions. At one hand, they move this way. On the other hand, they move that way. I'm saying at whose expense? And this is my problem. But anyway, the best point was that let's be concrete. You say let's be concrete. Let's be concrete. Let's not postulate. The body which was approached is the black body. And you say, oh, it could have been a white body, but why not?
No, I think let's be clear. And I think this will be a useful topic for us to go into separately, all right? So why the slave trade? And why does it run up against its own contradictions? So you're correct to say he supports Lincoln against the slavers. Now, Lincoln himself is not a slave owner, and what Marx advocates for is the end of slavery, but by revolutionary means. Why does Napoleon, by all means, have to crush the Black Republic in Haiti? Yeah, it's not only because of a colonial project. It is because if you end slavery, so certain levels of imperialist countries are able to move beyond slavery and successfully transition to the system of capitalist wage slavery, right? And those are the countries that come out on top as the imperialist powers that are still with us today. And so there are, even amongst those imperialist countries, these are transitions within struggle. And I think that's the important thing. There is not just this linear process where capitalism does as it wants to, right? Where capitalism and colonialism are simply these all-powerful things that can do as they please. They are introducing a system of wage slavery, which supplants actual slavery. And in many cases, of course, is worse than actual slavery, because the slave owner must still, to some extent, feed his slave. We live in a country today where people are given 350 rand and told, survive. That is a logical outcome of capitalist wage slavery. And that is the essence of Marx's critique of capitalism, right? So this does not negate the struggle against slavery or against oppression. So I think as an examination of where we are today and what lessons we draw, we may want to consider this exploration of slavery far more. You speak of the empirical basis of what has happened. I think it would be useful to explore that. I want to just comment very briefly on this your question about why the advice given, why the clarity that Trotsky has is not carried through by Marxists or so-called Marxists in South Africa over all the decades. Why do they dodge this question? Why do they run away from this thing? Why do they obfuscate it? Why do they try and not resolve this question for themselves when it is quite obvious that the motive force of the South African revolution is the black working class? Where I think Comrade Lindo and I would part ways. I've never quite subscribed or quite followed the logic of Pan-Africanism, to be honest with you, that anyone who is just an African is now, this resolves everything. That our problem is they took our land, and if we get our land back, then we are there. No, I think we must embrace Biko. We must embrace Biko as the necessary conclusion of the journey that Sobukwe and others begin. I'm not sure. I wanted to ask, comrades, you said Jaffa. Do you mean Hosea Jaffa?
Yes, yes, yes.
We can have a separate debate on that. You're killing me. You are killing me.
Is coming back in a big way in South Africa.
Yeah. Also, Comrade Glenn, I don't think in your answer you dealt with Andile's question there. I think this thing of slavery, we cannot dodge it this easily, right? Because even if Andile is to give into this argument that Africa was just a market, they could have chose Europe and anywhere else. The truth of the matter is that they didn't. And the question must be asked, why did they not enslave Europe? Why Africa? What if it's just a market a consideration? They could have just done it there. And it how the progress of history has happened, it shows that it was not just an arbitrary, like just an arbitrary choice. So I do think that something if you are going to disagree with what is just said, you have to give some reasons as to why Europe then was not done the same that Africa was. If it could have, easily been also enslaved.
So to speak to some of the historical points of this, right? So the first expeditions in mass slavery are actually not in Africa. When the Dutch and the Portuguese are running around the world, they try and they introduce the system of slavery in Malaysia, Indonesia, what was called Java, and so on. So they try the system, in fact. So to your point about what is the logic that drives them not to enslave their own people, yeah, is because they are operating under certain constraints of what they can and cannot do. And that's why I'm saying capitalism is a social relation. If you other people, if you make them invisible, if you dehumanize them over and over again, if in your practice, if in what you can control of their lives, their bodies, their minds, you can dominate them so completely and not even have to pay them wages. Is the capitalist logic not clear? Is it not perfectly
so then
logical?
We agree, Comrade Glenn, if that's what you mean, capitalism has a racial conscience. Capitalism
racist.
is a racial conscience.
It's racist
and
at its core.
Exactly so.
No, comrade, it's a commodity question. It's literally the price of a commodity. That's what I mean. Yes, it has. It is.
But why is the African commodity cheap? It's not even cheap. It's free.
It's free. Exactly.
Like,
what is it about the African? Because remember, your own workers, right, are existing in your own society. So to introduce slavery would, in effect, result in a massive struggle, which you would lose. So your ability to export this practice and import it into yourself and to gain from it, and then you can take from the labor of others which you have procured for free, yeah, at such a mass scale, and you can take a little bit of the surplus and you can buy off your own workers. It makes complete economic sense. That's all I'm saying about the slavery business. Yes, it has a race consciousness, but it makes complete economic sense. So what you're talking about
so comrade Glenn, I mean, just because we can bring it to contemporary, let's talk about what's happening right now in the United States of America. Racist, imperialist, brutal system. The bullets don't go to white bodies. They don't go to white workers. They don't go to white children. These bullets choose a particular body. Again, here, I mean, if you were to say it's a global capitalism, I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But this global capitalism's global nature is very clear about who must be murdered with no reason whatsoever. So again, I think you can't fudge the question.
Can I help you with this thing? Ask the indigenous peoples of America. When the whites came there, they exterminated them. They're gone, they're dead. They murdered them in mass. They slaughtered them. They committed genocide. That is not their country. Those white people who are there now, who are going on and on about America, was it theirs? Where are the people?
So we agree. We agree. You cannot sustain your argument about the indifference of capital to race.
No.
There are certain bodies which are treated in certain ways, and white people are ipso facto. I mean, it's a matter of course. When the white worker may be exploited, will not be murdered. The indigenous, the African, is available to death. And we are saying Marxism is totally incapable of accounting for this. This is our argument.
How? I've just accounted for it as a Marxist, to say that capitalism drives the necessity to oppress and destroy, to bring barbarism, to commit genocide.
Why doesn't it genocide white people?
It does, but because of its locale, its literal position in the world, capital is a social relation amongst white people for dominance. Yeah, but that a usage. I think, to be clear, that this is a necessary byproduct of capitalism. Racism is not accidental to capitalism. It is essential to how it functions.
Okay, Comrade Lindo. And if Comrade, if there are any more questions, if not, we're going to come to make our concluding remarks. There's a question from Comrade Gilbert Nchabeleng. He says, is race an impetus of capitalism or a symptom of it? And also, what was the pitfall of Marxist analysis of industrial capitalism in its pro-modal phase in Europe? More so, due to some of the claims made here that Marxism is pro-colonialism and anti-African, whilst African is a victim of capitalism. Then what led to the apt application of Marxism in Eastern Europe, regardless of the fundamental fact that Marx never lived in Europe? Okay.
I'm not sure I understand that last question.
Yeah, it looks like, I don't know, he says East Africa, then it's East Europe, and then he says Europe. Marx never lived in Europe, but he lived in Europe. So I don't understand. But let's just assume that, I mean, the first part, let's deal with the first part of the question.
Okay, whether race, okay, so let's start, Andile, where we all agree that race is, there is no such thing as race. There is only the biological existence of human beings as a species. What is constructed as race is socially constructed through time by people. And we acknowledge then the unit of race, yeah, as our identity against oppression. So I hope we're meaning the same thing. There is no...
Race exists.
Racism exists.
Race exists. Race exists.
As a social construct. And it can only be undone.
Everything is social construct. What isn't a social construct?
Yeah, but I'm saying the basis that we move from is that there is no scientific thing that there is a white person.
That's
there's no
irrelevant.
other
That is
species.
completely irrelevant. That is completely
Yeah.
irrelevant.
So
The
so
biology question is irrelevant.
so the point about capitalism is the impetus for capitalism. It's not an impetus. It's just that a certain group of people in a certain place acquire the skills, acquire the power of capital, and then express through themselves their own prejudice and racism and utilize it and make it essential to the system which they operate. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
No, that's fine. You deny the race question. You say specifically just power. If you have it, you oppress and you enslave
Not just
everyone
power.
the same way.
Not just
There's
power.
a fundamental disagreement on that question. There is a fundamental disagreement on that question. A fundamental disagreement on that question. I don't know, Comrade Lindo, whether you want to jump in there.
Yeah. Look, I think also the question of whether there's no such thing as racism, yeah, man, it's too old. Everything, as you say, Andile, is a social construct. So to discuss that is a non-factor here.
So is class a social construct? Can I ask?
Yes.
Okay, so which,
because you're going to need.
So if everything is a social construct, comrades.
Yes.
What does that leave us with?
It leaves us with a reality socially constructed.
But what drives that reality? What holds it together? What allocates power?
White supremacy today is what allocates power. White supremacy is what allocates power. And I mean, it's a historically created power which is concentrated in white people, and they are very clear about how to use it. They never use it against themselves. They don't genocide each other. In fact, the last time they did it, they brought the whole global system of the UN. The UN was about protecting white people against each other, never to do what they did to each other with the Jewish question. After the extermination of Jews, white people were so horrified that they could do this to each other. They set up the UN, and they had these universal rights, which rights were never given to black people. I mean, these people were sitting and saying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're all colonialists, including, of course, Jan Smuts from South Africa was sitting at the UN. So white people have crafted a global framework to protect each other against, of course, their murderous ways. But we are not protected by any sort of global system of rights. We as blacks have no rights.
Okay, but they exercise they exercise this global system through states, through governments, through a real machinery, police, army, courts, etc., media, education.
100%.
Yes, right. So,
yes.
Right, and that system ultimately it works for them because they are able to accumulate what they have not made. Yes, and if the ability to exploit and extract the surplus of the labor of others, it's not their labor, it's the labor of others. If their ability to do that ceases, the resolution of the question of their ability to run states and exercise privilege also logically comes to an end.
Yeah,
yes?
But where are you going with that? Because I mean, look, this is a little bit like saying black people can be racist, you know. The counter to the argument we're making that blacks can be racist. You say, yeah, you say under certain, you'll have to make a big hypothetical reality which does not exist, which does not exist.
But it is the reality that they run their system through through the system that they operate of white privilege is maintained through governments. It's maintained through armies and education.
So,
and if governments stray, they get deposed. If governments stray, they get deposed.
But okay. Comrade Glenn, what's your point? I'm trying to get like why are you bringing this up?
Because in another category of Marxist analysis, the state must be understood as an instrument of class oppression.
Okay.
And I think this is why I'm saying where we started was to begin to say that what does Marx assist us? What does he help us understand? That there's no such thing. There's no just exclusive terrain of something called economy, and then there's something called politics. These socially constructed realities are the interrelationship between these two things. And at the heart of that is the capitalist mode of production.
So the capitalist mode of production is not...
Okay, Comrade Lindo, I think we're all agreeing. This comrade has done a good job trying defending the Marxist perspective. He did his best. And I'm going to ask both of you to make your concluding remarks, and I'm going to try to sell a bit of blacks can't be racist in conclusion as well.
Yeah,
you have half a minute.
In conclusion, when I comment Andile, is that capitalism is inherently racist. We cannot read it in any other way. In its inner logic, it is a racist system, and one cannot understand it outside of understanding the primacy of race within how the system itself operates. I mean, even communists have been trying to find ways outside of this thing. They're unable to. The fact of the matter is that those that were exploited by capital are the black people, those whose bodies still to this day remain the bodies of exploitation and oppression of black bodies. Whether this thing was socially constructed or not, the fact of the matter is that it is a reality. When the bullet shoots, it doesn't shoot at some abstract type bourgeois idea of Afro-black thinking. It kills black bodies. And this is not just some superfluous idea that's out there. It is a reality of our people. So in basic forms, to read racism outside of the capitalist logic is to miss the point. These are not two social symbolic orders that operate in separate or could hypothetically have operated in separate. They operate together. What we've talked about Jaffe earlier on, he calls the holy trinity of colonialism, capitalism, and racism.
Thank you, Comrade Lindo. Comrade Glenn?
Well, I don't know what to say about that, because I think that, comrades, I think this debate is important. I think that perhaps we need to revisit Jaffe for all our benefit, so that we perhaps, I would like to advise that we can move beyond him and begin to plant our feet very, very firmly on the path that Black consciousness has set us. And it's a path that I think is well landmarked by revolutionary Marxism and Marxists, that we should advise our comrades not to make concessions to white privilege, that we must rely only on the strength of the black working class, which is the motive force of the socialist revolution, which liquidates white privilege permanently.
Thank you, Comrade Len, and also Comrade Lindo. All I can say is this debate is going to continue. We had invited a lot of the spokesperson of Marxists who, Comrade Len, have been very active in debating Comrade Lindo, but all of them, when we asked them, they simply did not have the time, or did not have the energy, or did not have the courage to come and defend what we have called baas Karl Marx. It is clear that the debate must continue, and this has real consequences, comrade. This is not an academic debate. This is a debate that helps us to organize ourselves in this battle. This is a debate that helps us to know who the enemy is, who our allies, what are we fighting for, what are we fighting against. It is not an academic debate. It's a very important debate that assists our cause in this phase of liberation. And I want to invite you all to check that essay, Blacks Can't Be Racist. There's a very sustained exposition of the difficulty of the creation of the black in an anti-black world, and where clearly the seeds of a critique of Marxism are planted. Marx, in my view, and this is my view, is that I'm done with Marx. Marx have nothing to say to me as a black person. And I hope in South Africa tomorrow, our children are not being exposed, black children. These are going to be black children who tomorrow are being forced to go to schools which are in a very horrible conditions, again, because the whole white system, capitalist system, has decided to put us at the bottom of the social order in South Africa. So no, race first, and siyabule. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Comrade Lindo. Thank you, Comrade Glenn. We are out.